Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Underground. I'm Nate Chen. Let's get dug into it. I want to start off this series by talking a little bit about what I mean by the cultural underground. And I know you've probably heard of underground music, or underground movies, or underground art. I mean, it has a lot of different connotations already. I kind of want to throw them all out the window just right off the bat. For starters, if you think of an underground movie, you may be thinking of something that's shown at film festivals and kind of builds up a cult following. That's not exactly what I want to go for in any way, shape, or form. In point of fact, I want to talk more about independent or small groups working on projects that maybe just aren't getting a whole lot of mainstream reception right now. So it's easier to give examples, I think, than to try and set a lot of hard and fast rules. So let me just walk you through some things that are and are not the kinds of things that I want to look at here. Let's start with some fairly underground kind of stuff that I followed when I was younger, and in some cases still follow, that are examples of it, and a few that are examples that are niche, that you may not have heard of, but are not really what I'm thinking of when I say underground. So let's start with the stuff that is underground productions. And we have here a trio of webcomics. You may have heard of some of these, maybe you haven't. Webcomics were a big thing in the late 90s and early aughts. They're not nearly as big a deal now, mainly because you can't make any money off of them anymore. It's certainly not like you could. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And I do intend to give each of these things kind of its own video at some point, or live stream, depending on how I ultimately wind up doing this. But I do want to talk about each of these in detail, so this is just going to be an overview. So let's start with the great granddaddy, at least for me, of webcomics, and that's Sluggy Freelance. This is by Pete Abrams. This has been going for something like 25, 26 years now, probably more than that even. Yeah, it started in 1997. So that's only 24 years. Okay, I guess not quite 25. So this is a webcomic. Pete Abrams was probably one of the first people to have an idea of the Patreon style system. Sluggy Freelance is currently funded by a subscription which Pete calls Defenders of the Nifty. One of the taglines of Sluggy Freelance being, is it not nifty? And of course, this is the first omnibus, which is called Born of Nifty. So it's kind of one of their shticks. And it's, I think, like a $30 a year subscription, and you get all of the things you kind of see on Patreon now, although he kicked it off before Patreon. And when it started when Patreon as a service started to pick up steam, Pete made several jokes about how he did that. This is a comic, and it shows a lot of the strengths and weaknesses of early web comics. It's kind of laid out like a newspaper comic strip, and maybe that was what Pete originally wanted to do with it. I know he's talked about it in interviews, and in here I would probably go back and read up on some of that before I do my full-length video. But Sluggy Freelance never found a distributor or a syndicator, so he released it online. And it's pretty good. I mean, this is not Marvel level storytelling, or good Marvel level storytelling. It's kind of meandering, especially in the early days. It was very focused on having a gag at the end of every strip, which could kind of interrupt the flow of stories. But it's been running so long, and he's been doing really well, maintaining continuity, even as silly as that continuity can get. And all in all, it does a really good job, I think, of showing the strengths and weaknesses of webcomics as a medium. So this is pretty underground. I don't know how many people have heard of this even now, even though it's been running for so long. Just because so many webcomics are niche, they have a hard time picking up audiences. And I mean, they are very impermanent. They come and they go a lot. If you have heard of it, that's great. This is, again, something I want to talk about, but this is a good example of an underground comic. Mega Tokyo is another example of a long-running webcomic that is pretty underground. Now, it's different in that they were going for more of a manga feel in this one, as the title kind of suggests. It started in this rectangular four-coma or four-panel setup. So less like a traditional newspaper strip and more like an actual book form comic, which is of course what it is here. And eventually we transition, to more traditional pages. So Mega Tokyo, long running comic, not as much content as Sluggy Freelance. In the last 10 years or so, it has not been as productive as it was early in its run for a number of reasons, which are not really relevant to this recap. But again, small team working on this. It started as Fred Gallagher and Rodney Caston, and Caston dropped out probably about 2 years into this. Don't quote me on that. Again, I would have to go back and read up on some history there. But Mega Tokyo is funny. It's geeky. It doesn't have quite that emphasis on a gag at the end of every strip or every page, I guess, given the way this is laid out. But it did start off as kind of a gag series, and it grew into a more story-driven series. It made that transition much faster than Sluggy Freelance did, so it reads much more like a story comic. But not so much as our final example. And this is kind of the limits of the underground label, I guess. This is Girl Genius by Phil and Kasia Folio. And Phil and Kasia are professional artists. In fact, Girl Genius was for a little while published and put in comic shops, I believe. Phil and Kasia are professional artists, illustrators, and storytellers. You've probably seen their artwork on Magic the Gathering cards from the early days, and in other professional illustrating circles. And of course, they have some comics they worked on besides Girl Genius. But Girl Genius now is pretty much just a webcomic. They publish it online, and they run Kickstarters to fund their books. This is actually the omnibus, which was put out through Tor. And they had this publishing deal for like a hot minute. I don't think you can still find this anywhere, which is a shame. It's a really nice book. It has the first 3 volumes of the story, and this is a really cracking good story about adventure, romance, and mad science. And Girl Genius now suffers from a bit of the Whedon-esque stereotyping or prejudice. People talk about the Whedon speak and the very quippy and irreverent characters that Joss Whedon is really known for. And Joss Whedon does it well, and just about everybody who imitates him doesn't. Girl Genius kind of feels like that. The protagonist is a mad scientist. Her name is Agatha. She's right there on the cover. And a lot of these modern comic science girls feel a little bit like Agatha. However, the Folios are just better at writing this kind of thing. Their previous comic series, Buck Godot's Zap Gun for Hire, was a sci-fi series that had a lot of really good science in it. And they know how to juggle fantastical elements and the scientific elements. Anyways, I'm wandering more into an analysis of this, which is not what I want to do. So, but in general, given the experience and connections the Folios have, they've won Hugos for this series. This is almost not an underground series anymore. And I really am going to classify it as such simply because the Folios do just about everything themselves these days. They maintain the website. Well, they might contract out the website. They hire a colorist, but otherwise they run Kickstarters to get everything published. And they publish independently. Again, Tor does not have this book deal anymore. Again, that's a shame. I really would like this to see some more mainstream acceptance because it is a great story. But more on that when we talk about these things individually. Let's talk about something other than webcomics. Yes, we will be doing that. Some here, some there. So this is what I would consider underground music from my misspent youth. This is Five Iron Frenzy's Quantity is Job One, put out by Tooth and Nail Records. This was a really small record label that I believe isn't around anymore. I could be wrong. Tooth and Nail might still exist. Don't quote me on it. I am not that into the music scene, but I do know Five Iron Frenzy, never a really big band. They kickstart their albums now. Both they kickstarted 2 albums. They do most of the work themselves, and with some audio engineers that they've worked with for a long time. They are not a lot of people have heard of them. They are really good at what they do. I love their music a lot, and but they're not a big name. They've never had a big record deal. The closest they've got to the big time was they one of their songs appeared on what was it? Not Law and Order, whatever that crime show was with William Shatner, because they mentioned William Shatner in one of their songs. So they the people who made that show got a 30-second clip of the song, and I guess they bought the rights and they put it in or something. Anyway, so that's about as close as they've gotten to mainstream. I'm not even sure they got any kind of significant credit for it, so not really that big a deal. Oh, it was funny to hear about. I never watched Boston Legal. I don't know. Anyways, so that would be an example of underground music. I'm going to talk a little bit about underground fiction. I get most of this in the form of ebooks, so I don't have anything to show you. But some examples of that would be the Wearing the Cape series by Marion G. Harmon, which is superhero lit, and that's an underground genre to start with, and it's independently published again, so there's that qualifier, and it's in an obscure genre, little known author. And that is something I would consider to be underground literature or underground books. Let's talk about some things that are not underground, even though you may never have heard of them. This is The 12 Kingdoms by Fuyumi Ono. This is a great series of fantasy novels written by a Japanese author. They were translated by, I believe, Seven Seas. Is that correct? Seven Seas Publishing. Let's not quote me on that. But oh no, this is Tokyo Pop. Duh. It says it right there. I don't know how many remember Tokyo Pop, but this is it's a good series of novels, but they are very Japanese. They don't have a lot of appeal to the American audience, but they are kind of mainstream to the point that there was a TV show made based on them in Japan. So this is not really underground. Anime has become very mainstream, and although 12 Kingdoms is on the older side, it did have an anime adaptation that was released in the States. So I'm not going to count this as underground, even though it's obscure. Also, there's the simple reality that in Japan, to get a novel like this published, you basically have to go through the mainstream. There's nothing underground about this in its original context, and that disqualifies it, in my opinion. There are, of course, a lot of web novels in Japan, and that would be closer to something underground, but I'm not really interested in talking about those, so there probably won't be anything like that. Here's another thing that's not underground. China Mayville's Rail Sea. This is a fantastic novel. You've probably never heard of it again. It is a product of a somewhat popular British sci-fi fantasy author, really just sci-fi, based on what I've read. He's been a writer in residence at colleges in Britain. It's a New York Times bestseller. Again, just about any book that's not Stephen King or James Patterson or J.K. Rowling is kind of obscure in this day and age. That's unfortunate, but it's the truth. And as such, you have to be a little more discerning in what counts as underground. So this isn't underground. I'm sorry, China. You got too much street cred in literary circles to really count this. Even though it's a great book, even though you've probably never heard of it, even though it's in a pretty niche genre, not underground. What else is not underground? This is Created in Darkness by Troubled Americans from McSweeney's, which is a literary website. This is a hilarious book. It's got a bunch of really obscure literary humor in it. I've read it several times and laughed every time, and it's not at all underground. You would think with as obscure as some of these topics are that it would be underground. But again, this is among people who write books. There's a lot of mainstream culture in here, and as such, it's not underground. Another example of something that is not underground would be the Timothy Zahn novel Soulmancer, which I really need to find some venue to talk about in length. But the reality is that Timothy Zahn is a pretty well-known sci-fi author, and even though he self-published Soulmancer, I believe, or he published it through a fairly obscure publisher, one of those two. I definitely never heard of the people who worked on it before. That is not underground simply because Timothy Zahn has a lot of clout in sci-fi circles. He's written several very popular sci-fi novels in the Star Wars franchise, both in the Legends line or the extended universe as we knew it when I was young, and in the Disney official continuity now. And that alone is enough to move him out of the underground into the mainstream. And even though you've probably never heard of Soulminder or some of his other more recent books, which are through pretty small publishing houses, the reality is that his name has so much clout. It's not underground. Talking a little bit about film, some things that I would consider to be underground film. Again, I don't have any good examples to hold up and show you. But if you were to look up on YouTube, Evan Royalty, he makes underground films, whether it's trailers for video games or his SCP series, which is really fantastically well made. That is underground film and entertainment. Some, not all, but some classifications of fan work would count as underground as well. I don't have a good example for a fan animation off the top of my head. Probably should have done a little research and written some down there. But also, some things that I would consider to be underground on independent animation. Things like Has Been Hotel. Kind of, I don't know. You start to hit a squishy point when you start looking at these independently made films and animations, because when they release online, they pick up a lot of attention and a lot of steam. And that's probably going to be more of a judgment call on my part. Really looking at the kind of promotional network, the kind of resources and studio access that people may or may not have had. I will have to spend time really kind of breaking that down. But so that should give you an idea of things that are and are not underground for the purposes of this discussion. And I want to focus on these individual creators as opposed to these broader publishing groups or these broader small studios as opposed to large studios, or in music terms, small labels as opposed to large labels, because these are really where you get a strong sense of an individual's creative vision for a thing. And that's what really excites me these days about entertainment and about culture. I know we talk a lot about great entertainment, great storytelling, but when you take in a lot of media and you really start immersing yourself in the creative process, which is something I have done since I was in college, because one of my ambitions is to be an entertainer. I want to be a writer. I have performed in over a dozen stage plays in the last 10 years. I watch and analyze movies, and I break down and analyze novels for fun as much as for my own creative growth. You start to kind of get jaded, and that's unfortunate because things kind of blend together. There are, a lot of people who are just doing the same kinds of things, and finding people who are really expressing a single individual creative vision rather than chasing a trend or following the herd are really striking out in their own directions, and they're the kind of people I want to give attention to. Now, there are some people who have done that and done it so successfully, I don't really think I'm going to talk about them. Perfect example of this would be, I believe his name is Toby Fox, the creator of Undertale. This is very much an underground game, and not just because the entire story takes place underground, but really he did everything himself, and that's amazing. He did a great job with it. But Undertale is pretty mainstream now. It has huge fan communities, YouTube fan animations dedicated to it, people who make fan games, all this other stuff. You can't really consider that underground anymore. So, I mean, obviously it started under those circumstances, but I want to be talking about individual creators who are really trying to bring us something fresh and something new. And this isn't to be snobbish. This isn't to say the mainstream has no place. I'm not super invested in a lot of mainstream entertainment right now. And I want to share and celebrate a lot of the things that are less mainstream but are still really good. And have a lot of things to tell us about how people are experimenting with entertainment, experimenting with storytelling, because that is my big passion. I mean, I shared Fire and Frenzy as a case of an underground band, but I really don't follow underground music, and I'm not qualified to talk a whole lot about it. Maybe I'll have a guest on that could help us with that some more. But really, I want to look at the exciting things that are happening on the fringes and that we might see trickling into the mainstream in another 10 years or so, because that's what really excites me right now. So that's the kind of the thrust of this series going forward. I would love to see you share down in the comments stuff that you think is great underground entertainment, stuff that I could look into and talk about as this series goes on. Of course, one of the things about underground entertainment is it's very hard to find, and I'm not an expert on it. So if you share me your favorite examples of underground entertainment, I'll have more things I can look into and more things I can talk about, break down, and analyze. Again, that's something that really excites me, so I hope to see you all sharing that down there. Anyway, so if you enjoy this, if you want to go on this journey through weird and kind of fringe entertainment that is doing new and exciting stuff, by all means subscribe, comment below, again, sharing things you want to see me talk about, or if you have any questions about my standards or what I'm going to be doing going forward, be sure to comment about that. If there was any of the examples that I gave here that I plan to be making videos on going forward that you really want to see discussed, be sure to comment that as well. And I will talk to you later.